Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Office of International Programs International Symposium 2022. My name is Kathleen Fairfax. I am the Vice Provost for International Affairs, and I want to welcome everyone here to our keynote speaker today. Before I begin with introductions, I would like to take a few moments to read CSU's land acknowledgement. Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. Well, again, thank you all for joining us today. And I will just do a couple of brief introductions and then we will get to our content. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Erin O'Toole. Erin is the host and producer of KUNC's Colorado edition. Erin will be serving as our moderator for today's talk. Erin works closely with the team of producers and reporters to bring context and diverse perspectives to the important issues of the day on the Colorado edition of KNUC. Before joining the team at KNUC in 2009, as the morning edition host, Erin worked in commercial radio and served as host of morning edition and reporter for KVCR in San Bernardino, California. So welcome, Erin, and thank you for your role in today's seminar.
Thank you.
Our keynote speaker today is Lulu Garcia-Navarro. Lulu joined the New York Times opinion audio team last year to anchor a new podcast that will be forthcoming that I'm sure will be talked about a little bit later. This podcast will explore the personal side of opinion. It will focus on how we come to believe what we believe and what happens when our beliefs get tested, a timely topic. Before joining the New York Times, as most of you know, Lulu was the host of Weekend Edition at NPR, where she reported on everything from the Me Too movement to immigration to the pandemic. She was the first Latina to be at the helm of an NPR flagship show. Lulu worked as an NPR correspondent in Brazil, Israel, Mexico, and Iraq. Her series on the Amazon rainforest was a Peabody finalist and won the Edward R. Murrow Award for Best New Series. Her coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and her reporting of the Arab Spring uprising afforded her with wide acclaim and 5 awards in 2021, including the Edward R. Murrow and Peabody Awards for her coverage of the Libyan revolt. Lulu has extensive experience interviewing world leaders, authors, artists, people living on the front lines of changing our world. She has trekked through the Amazon to talk to environmental vigilantes. She's traveled to numerous war zones to interview militants, and she sat with asylum seekers on the US-Mexican border. It has been said about Lulu that she is changing the way that we hear the news. And with that, I welcome this conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Lulu, it's so great to be able to talk to you in a setting like this. We have a lot to cover in not a lot of time. So I want to get right to it. And I want to start with the title of this talk. For those who haven't seen it, It's how we collectively lost our minds, a journalist trying to cover today's world. There's a lot there. So can you talk about that? Because I feel like it can give us a lot of insight into what it's like in journalism right now.
Yeah, I mean, shall I start with just a silent scream? The title was sort of inspired by what I have been seeing in the United States and across the world really at the moment. I mean, we are at a moment where things are not only polarized, but I feel like they're fracturing in ways that we haven't seen before. And, that certainly was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic has really accelerated that. I just went down to Spotsylvania County in Virginia and sat in on a school board meeting and have been talking to people there about their feelings surrounding, the very contentious issues around schools. And it was interesting to me, as I was listening to all these arguments, just how intimate things feel now, that these fractures that we've been facing in our society now just feel like they're on our doorstep. We might now disagree with people that we might have agreed with before over things like masks, over things like vaccines. You don't really know anymore which side of an issue someone's gonna fall on. I feel like when I came back from Brazil and landed in the United States in 2017, it was just at the beginning of the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
And what was so surprising to me was that this deep polarization that you see in other countries was evident here, but people have sort of cleaved in two. They were sort of pro-Trump and anti-Trump. They were divided on issues, big issues like immigration and race. And now it's like everyone is divided on these very, very small issues that are very close to them, that are about the way their children are being raised. Then they're about, how and what we put in our bodies. And it's no longer about, Democrat versus Republican necessarily. Our tribes are getting a lot smaller.
Yeah, the whole polarization today feels very different from the traditional red versus blue, conservative versus liberal that we might have thought of in the past. Has that become more evident in the pandemic?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the reasons I wanted to sort of talk about us collectively losing our minds isn't to say that all these concerns aren't rooted in something that's real that we're feeling. But I also think that we're in a place right now where we are overwhelmed. We are overwhelmed by having to do another Zoom symposium and having to take care of our kids that might be quarantined from home and having to figure out how to navigate this very, very contentious period in our politics. And that's not only in the United States, we're seeing echoes of that absolutely everywhere. And there's this, sort of big battle playing out about how we want to live our lives. But the way that manifests, inside our homes and within our groups of people that we interact with is having all these different ramifications. And so, as a journalist, navigating that, trying to sort of illuminate that is the real work. And what is fascinating to me is that a lot of that sort of inspiration just comes from the stuff that I'm experiencing and the stuff that I see within my own family and, the divisions that I see play out amongst the people that I know.
And in your work right now, you mentioned Spotsylvania and kind of digging into what's going on with school board races and these very contentious meetings that are happening. How do you see this play out around the kitchen table, for lack of a better word, in America?
Oh my goodness. I mean, what's great for journalists at this particular period is that I could talk to anyone watching this right now, and I could say, tell me a story about how this is playing around at your kitchen table. And you would tell me a great story because we all know it, right? This is why we're all collectively losing our minds. We all feel it. We all feel these pressures, and they're having these different ramifications in different ways. And so, one example is one of the people that I was talking to down in Spotsylvania, and she's a young girl, she's a high school senior, and she loves books, and all of a sudden she finds the people that are overseeing her education talking about banning books, and books that are specifically about things have to do with her own identity, but she comes from a very conservative family. And so that is causing all sorts of tensions within her family because she falls on one side of an issue and her parents, or at least her father falls on a different side of an issue. And so, you're just seeing this, people are really trying to figure this out in all sorts of different ways. And what was really interesting to me about Spotsylvania in particular is that this is a conservative county, went for Trump by 52%. And so sitting at that school board meeting, I couldn't tell you necessarily what people's ideology was by what they were saying, because actually the fault lines, again, are so much more narrow. So you have people who would self-identify as conservative, but would say, I differ with you on this issue, and I am going to really fight you on it. And so we're not seeing what we're used to seeing in America, this kind of very even split of like liberal, conservative, red, blue. We're now seeing these fractures in all sorts of different directions. And it's causing, difficulties. I mean, I went to go have dinner the other night with friends of mine, and they would say that they fall on the more liberal side of the spectrum. And they were really concerned about issues around critical race theory and what was happening in public schools. And this is not something that traditionally you would think was necessarily an issue that was going to be resonant in the same way to people who might perceive themselves as liberal, but it is. And so I have found all this fascinating. I have found it really interesting to see that people's identity at the moment is changing. The way people feel like they know who they are and the issues that are important to them are changing. And I think that that's going to open up the political landscape in very complicated ways in the next election.
Indeed. And I think what's interesting too is we can think about issues and where we might fall on a particular side of an issue. But what a lot of people it seems really complicated right now is this truth. That what is the truth, capital T? And how do we kind of get to what is the truth? And how does this intersect with where journalism is and what journalism is doing right now?
I mean, so journalism is in a crisis. I'm not saying anything that someone doesn't know. And, we chatted a little bit about this, right? There's often this thing that pollsters do, and they'll come to the public and they'll say, do you trust the media? And then you'll see this, absolutely, we do not trust the media. And it's been going down and down and down. And then everyone wrings their hands and goes, oh my God, look, they don't trust the media. This is going to damage democracy. And I think actually it's a much more complicated picture than that. I think what we're seeing is that if you asked people, do you trust Fox News? And they were Fox News viewers, they'd say, over 80%, I trust Fox News. And if you said to someone who's a reader of the New York Times, do you trust the New York Times? Do you trust NPR if they listen to NPR? And they'd say, overwhelmingly, yes, I trust. But if you say the media, you're always imagining like this other group that you don't necessarily trust or believe in. And so I think that that's really part of some of the complexities that we're seeing because, media is just one portion of a wider crisis that I think we're seeing in this country, which has to do with institutions. People, and this is on both sides of the political spectrum, are seeing institutions not responding to the needs that they have. They're seeing them not be there in the way that they feel like they should be. And so now you're having a crisis in all these different institutions because for many different reasons, people don't feel that they're responsive. And the media, quote unquote, is part of that. I would want to make a distinction between the fact-based media, what I consider the fact-based media, the media that actually has guardrails, the media that actually, if you get something wrong, there are repercussions for that. There are editorials, you have to have an editor's note, a correction, and then organizations that actually are purveyors of opinion and misinformation. And those are two different types of media landscapes. But unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more is that there's, less people don't understand the difference. There's a massive mistrust. And I think that connection with our audiences is, harder and harder to maintain, because people, if they just read one thing that they don't like, if they just like, I didn't want to hear that voice, or you asked a question in a way that I don't think, was respectful, or you didn't ask the question that I think you should have asked, you weren't pushing back enough in the way that I think that you should. I know that you probably get this all the time. You get a lot of people coming at you and saying, like, they see it as part of a wider narrative that somehow the media has failed them, that it isn't doing its job.
Right. And that's an important distinction to make too, between those different types of media. I want to step back to your time as a foreign correspondent. Many of us here this afternoon know you from your work with NPR, but also before that, as a journalist, you covered news in the Middle East and in Latin America. In your years covering those regions, I'm wondering how you have seen attitudes toward the media shift.
Yeah, I think this is part of a global trend. I mean, I think, there's a bunch of stuff going on. I mean, first of all, we are seeing globally a big ideological battle between autocracies and democracies. And so there is this big sense that, is a democracy really the best way to govern? And I think if you think about it in the pandemic, you'll see this a lot, where governments that are autocracies might have weathered the pandemic better, right? Because they have a compliant population, they're able to enforce rules and regulations much more forcibly. And so, whereas democracies, by and large, have seen a lot of upheaval. I mean, there's of course distinctions to this, but one would be hard pressed to say, well, that shows that an autocracy is better than a democracy if you live in a democracy, and you uphold that. But there's this big ideological split about how the world is shaking out and which sort of version is going to prevail. And so within that, the media has a really big role to play, because we are at its best independent. We are trying to speak truth to power. We are trying to investigate abuses. We are, at its very basic level, we act on behalf of the public, right? When we talk about the public's right to know, in the media, that's what we're doing. We're talking about the public's right to know. We are acting for you. We're not doing it for us. We always weigh these things, right? When we think about something that's very sensitive, maybe state secrets, we think, how important is this for the public to know? Or how important is this, for state security to be kept private? And so these things are very complicated, and we think about it. We think about them when we debate them a lot. And so when we think about this sort of media landscape that we're involved in at the moment, I would say that the dire situation that we see in the United States, in which local news has been decimated, in which there's a huge mistrust of media organizations, in which we see, some media organizations thriving, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, like NPR, but by and large, a lot of other media organizations sort of withering on the vine. We're seeing that play out in all sorts of different places in the world. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Mexico, if you look at the Middle East, you are seeing versions of this happen everywhere, where journalists are no longer seen as a sort of agents of democracy, but they're seen as threats. And in places like Mexico, they're being killed in huge numbers, and in other places, they're being jailed in huge numbers. And it's a crisis of freedom of information. And that's the way that it should be framed, and that's the way that I often try to discuss it. It's not that this is a crisis of journalism. This is a crisis of freedom of information. That is what happens when you kill or silence journalists. What you're trying to do is stop the flow of information to the public, and it's very dangerous.
Right. I mean, at least here in the US, freedom of the press still exists. It's still a thing, but it does feel more difficult to get out there and do that job with this growing mistrust in the institution.
Yeah. I face it a lot, when you're out talking to people, especially, groups that have, now sort of ideological mistrust of the media, it is very hard to sort of break through that and to portray yourself as an honest broker, because people feel, and sometimes rightly so, that we have failed to sort of be transparent on occasion. We have failed to represent their views. If you think about, traditionally communities of color, the mainstream media has failed, to really reflect the concerns of those communities, and to sort of, instead of going in and just reporting about them, report for them. And that's a real big distinction. And many groups feel that way. Many groups feel that they have been let outside of the traditional narratives, and that their concerns and realities are not properly reflected. And so that just feeds this mistrust. This feeds this sense of like, that the media is an other as opposed to a representative of us all.
Right. And we kind of talked about how that affect the views of the media, but have you seen attitudes toward the truth shift in some of these other regions, maybe where a little more authoritarian rule is there or taking over?
I mean, define truth. I mean, that's the big thing that we struggle with, right? Where we're trying to sort of, I always use the word truth. I always say, like, I'm trying to get at an approximation of the truth. But within that, there are multitudes. I remember when I used to report from Iraq, and there would be a bombing, an explosion, some sort of catastrophe. And we would arrive, and you would have one person say, it was an American helicopter and it just fired a missile onto this facility and all these people were killed, and would just be telling you this as if it was truth. And then the next person would come and they would say, no, it was a truck that came in and was loaded with explosives and blew up. And there'd be another person who said, no, it was actually a gas canister that was, not stored in the correct way, and it blew up. And so when you go into a situation like this, what is the truth? What is the thing that actually happened that you are going to come away with and trying to piece together this idea of the truth? And so, of course, it starts with facts, and there is a thing that actually happened in those circumstances. Often you can see either if there was the remains of a missile, or if there's a crater, or if that, there's different things that you can do with your eyes and ears to sort of determine what the truth is and what the facts of the case are. That becomes a lot harder when you're trying to parse together, things to do with the way people feel about an issue, the way that they, like, what is the truth behind the way people feel about schools in America and what they should be doing? What is the truth behind that? And so that then is about the way people are interacting with this moment. They can back it up and say, look, I found these books have, touch on subjects like pedophilia. That means that they're indoctrinating my children, to be pedophiles. I'm using an example that isn't true, but and so I'm giving you what I consider to be the facts to show my case to be true. And so I think that's where we really struggle at this moment, to kind of parse this through, because all of us are living in these very different realities, these very different circumstances. And the things that we feel are going to, bolster our arguments, are different for different people. I come from a politically divided family, and there is a huge chasm between the way the different sides see things. I mean, the thing they always agree on is that they hate journalists, so that's good. But
at least there's
there's one thing. So I'm super popular at Christmas, but beyond that, there's a lot of really big tensions over how to engage in the world. And now we've seen that play out in all sorts of interesting ways. Just getting together over Christmas was really fraught. Who was vaccinated? Who wasn't vaccinated? Who was willing to get tested if they weren't vaccinated? All these different things now are no longer just sort of like speculative. It's like, actually, your decision is going to impact my life in ways that it might not have before. And so now this idea of truth and what the reality is, has become much more loaded, right? And so if my sister just says, I don't want to be vaccinated and I don't believe in masking and wants to come to the family dinner with my 80-year-old mother. Whereas before I could say, oh, you believe a thing that I don't believe, that's fine. We don't, you have the right to believe it. And she would, this is a hypothetical as well, but she would say, I have the right to believe, well, why don't you just respect my opinion? Now, of course, what you're doing is, I believe, is impacting me. And she believes what I'm doing is impacting her. And so now, right, this thing that was this big thing that was out there is inside our family, is inside our home, and is causing a huge amount of tension in a way that we wouldn't have seen before.
Yeah. And here's a classic case of where you can have the facts at your side as you know them, but it may not make a difference because this is about emotion.
Right. And so again, we get back to that, important thing of what is truth. And, we've seen all throughout this pandemic, breakdowns of communication, here the CDC, but in other places all over the world, organizations that were meant to sort of be purveyors of the truth and of facts. And because things have changed, because understanding has changed, because messaging has been complicated, people now are left with this feeling of, I can't trust anyone, I can't trust anything. And so it's a very hard thing to sort of surmount. And I think about it often with my child, because on the one hand, I want her to trust facts. I want her to believe, quote, in science. I also want her to be critical. I also want her to be inquisitive and to not just take what she's given without interrogating it. And so it's a difficult dance at a time like this when, all these moving parts, everything is difficult. We're having these really hard conversations. And, I have found myself on the other side of issues from people that I never would have expected that to be true. Like I just have suddenly been like, wait, you believe that thing? How can that possibly be? How did you get there? How did you land on that answer to that question? And I think that's something that we're all finding. We're being surprised in ways that are different now.
Yeah, I think you just summed up all of our last year's Thanksgiving, Christmas experiences. I just want to drop in a reminder here that if you have a question for Lulu, you can submit it through the Q&A, and we'll try to get to some near the end if we can. I wanted to ask about January 6th and how this is coming up in your work right now. It felt like a really big earthquake along a fault line that was always there, but we just weren't aware of it. And how are you kind of seeing that play out, with the polarization today?
Well, I think January 6th is a perfect example of where we're at, right? Because on one side of the aisle, everyone thinks it's an incredibly important thing. I agree with them. I was in Washington, D.C. that day and intersected with people who were involved in that. And, having lived abroad and having seen things like that happen in other places that are, not democracies, but war zones, or places that are, in the process of completely reconfiguring the way that they're governed, it was profoundly shocking to me to see that happen here in the United States, profoundly. Even though, and I had been having enormous arguments with my husband in the run-up, because I was sending my husband all these articles like, hey, this isn't this isn't good. This is going to be materially different than what has been, there had been rallies, pro-Trump rallies and all this stuff. I was like, this is going to be materially different than what has come before. Yeah. And, there had been a lot of writing about it. And I was always confused why, agencies in this country didn't sort of know that. But it was clear to me that it was going to be very, very different. At the same time, you have part of the country that feels that this was legitimate and that this was an expression of political grievance, and that that the people, not the people who vandalized, not the people who, kind of did terrible actions, but just generally that expression of rage is is something that is actually warranted because they feel that something was taken from them. And so, we're still sorting that out. I, at the time, wrote a piece, asking a question that I had thought about a lot since I was in Iraq, which was when I was in Iraq, I was there for, in and out for a decade. But at the beginning, we would always ask ourselves this question: are we in civil war yet? Are we in civil war yet? And I went, I remember looking back after January 6th to this piece that I'd done about this mosque in a neighborhood, and the people building the mosque were of a different sect, and they were all getting disappeared one by one. And it sort of was built around this bigger question of, is this a civil war? And I look back now at the date in the 2020 of hindsight, and I'm like, oh, we were in the Civil War. I just hadn't realized it yet. We were still asking the question, but like in hindsight, it was so clear that that was already underway. And so when January 6th happened, a lot of people were asking themselves, and I was asking myself, and I think, some people are still asking themselves, what is the conflict in this country? Is this a conflict that is going to lead to more and more January 6th, and by that I mean very public and violent confrontations of groups of people? Or is this a polarization that, will continue as it is, but it'll be sort of like at a simmer, and it'll flare up in different places, but that, essentially speaking, it's sort of manageable. And I've read a lot about this. I've thought a lot about this. Academics who study conflicts have kind of have come on different sides of this. Some think of it sort of like it might turn into a Belfast situation, Northern Ireland, we have like insurgencies. Some people think, no, that'll never happen in the United States. And what we'll see is just sort of flaring of armed confrontations. But even the fact that we're having these debates and discussions shows you that where America is at right now is materially different than a place than we've been before, and in our day-to-day lives, we might not feel it as much, but these big themes are playing out in all sorts of places.
It's comforting to hear that, you've seen the worst. So I've been thinking about this a little bit with the current situation with Russia and Ukraine. The US has been traditionally held up as a model of democracy, a beacon. Perhaps unfairly, we've been thought of as the world's police officer too, for good and bad.
Well, we've also tried to be that. So
we have, you're right. That is
tried to be that.
Not unfounded. Do you see attitudes changing around the US getting involved in situations overseas? Should we? Is that changing here?
So that's what's interesting to me as well, when we look at sort of the fault lines on Ukraine and we think about where traditionally different political groups have been on Russia or on intervention. And we're seeing a lot more now on the left. Why should we be getting involved in Ukraine? We are not a democracy anymore. Look at what happened on January 6th. Physician, heal thyself before you go out trying to, support democracy elsewhere. I've seen things like that on the left, and I've seen things like that on the right. Do you know what I mean? I have seen both those things there. I have seen, the Republican Party push back against Russia, and I've seen the Republican Party say, actually, Russia is not the problem here. And so again, when I talk about these fractures, they're playing out, on this world stage with the highest possible stakes. Before, you would understand pretty much where maybe a different party might fall on a particular issue. And now, again, those lines are blurred. I mean, Republicans used to be, absolutely united in the idea that Russia was the bad guy, right? I mean, in most scenarios, Soviet Union previously, that maybe Russia wasn't the bad guy, but they certainly weren't, you know, our friends. And so, you know, to see how that has shifted over time, to see the different places where people now think the United States should and shouldn't be. But I do think we're in a period of retraction from the world. I think we have just ended America's longest war in a chaotic and, you know, horrible fashion that was a national embarrassment. And I think Americans, by and large, from both political parties, you know, polls show it, and so does anecdotal evidence, that the bar is pretty high to get involved somewhere else. You know, I mean, the bar now is pretty high to say, you know, why should we go and protect this place that is so far away? What is the point of that? But then it's complicated, right? Because then that opens the door to actors saying, well, if America isn't going to step in, then maybe I can just take a nibble here. Maybe I can take a bite there. And that's, you know, as we know from the past, that's how big wars start, you know? So it's not an easy dance.
I want to get to a question here from Robert. We've heard trying to provide facts to those who have alternative facts is not a good approach to engagement. So how do you provide a dialogue with people who have those views or those alternative facts?
So this is a really important question, because I think at the beginning of all this, right, everyone thought like aggressive fact checking, you know, we'll just fact check this and we will convince the other side that they will understand that what they are saying is fundamentally wrong. And we have learned a few things. We've learned that, first of all, you know, misinformation travels like 15 times around the world while, you know, facts are getting their pants on. So that's the first thing. Like it doesn't have the same reach. The fact check does not have the same reach as the original misinformation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I can, till I'm blue in the face, say, blah, 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 actually, blah, 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 blah. And I've tried. I've even been like, I am a journalist. I know these things. I have been to this thing. I can tell you that that is categorically not the case. And it makes not a lick of difference. And one of the things that I've realized, and this again is something in my own family, is that, and this is the hardest thing I think about misinformation. We often talk about misinformation and we think of like, oh, these are bad actors putting misinformation out there and people are being duped, and, you know, and they're sort of suckers, and they're people who don't really understand the reality of what is happening. And what actually is going on is that, you know, it again comes from people actually having a difference of opinion, thinking that, you know, difference of opinion means that what they consider to be true is true, and them not really caring that they're passing on misinformation, you know, because for them, it's the misinformation, even if they probably know that maybe this thing isn't true, they don't understand why it's bad to pass it on. And I've seen that. I've had this argument in my family in like small ways. I remember in my WhatsApp family group, one of my my sister-in-law sent this letter, and it was supposedly written by Bill Gates, and it was kind of nice, actually. No, it wasn't like a bad thing. It wasn't. Okay. Yeah, it was sort of like, but it was kind of written like he'd written a poem, and it was like about, I don't know. It was a weird thing, but it was like, oh, look what Bill Gates wrote, but it was sort of like, you've got to take everybody at face value. You have to let, you know, it was that kind of thing. It's like Bill Gates, like writing a poem about like, the facts don't matter and you really just have to listen to people. It was basically it. And I was like, I don't think that Bill Gates wrote that. I'm pretty sure that I don't think that that's true. And so I then, in my family WhatsApp group, you know, so I'm like, I'll Google it quickly. And I'm like, of course, there it is, you know, on Snopes, like Bill Gates did not write facts are, you know, relative and you should embrace everybody. And in a poem. And so I write back and I'm like, here's the link. Look, Bill Gates didn't write that. And, you know, And I got in so much trouble from everybody, even people who agree with me and are like, you should, because they're like, oh, come on, it was a nice thing to say. She was just trying to be nice. Like, why are you making her feel bad? And I then go into a whole thing where I'm like, listen, and this was super unhelpful, because then I do this whole thing, which is like, this little thing that you think that you've done that is like, oh, I'm just going to put a thing out there. And it doesn't matter if it's true, if it's not true, because it's made you feel good. This actually is linked to the erosion of, our idea of what facts are and truth. And it is linked to basically the demise of democracy. So you can imagine how well that went down. So this poor thing that
popular.
Yeah, very popular. That my sister-in-law sent to sort of be like, I know we're falling on other sides of things, but let's not fight. Look, Bill Gates agrees, became like me then doing a treatise on like how, in fact, you don't, you are actually contributing to the demise of democracy. What I have learned from that, and what research has shown, is that in fact, these things are not the way to engage the other side. And that actually what is helpful to engage the other side of whatever you're debating is sort of empathy and storytelling, and having someone understand your humanity and your point of view. I could have engaged in that in a different way. I could have said, I understand why you sent this, and thank you. The message is beautiful. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but as a journalist, as someone who really, whose job it is to combat this, I've just seen so much of this be harmful. It's like a gateway drug, because a small thing that you accept that isn't true actually allows you to then accept bigger things that aren't true. It's a weird thing. That's why in a lot of misinformation websites, they'll always start with like things that are kind of true about things that don't matter. And then they end up with things that are really untrue, because it allows you to kind of, your immunity to it kind of shifts over time. And so I could have engaged in that in a completely different way. And so I think, what we've seen in studies is that people will have a much better time listening to you if you can engage them in your humanity and in a sort of, and tell them the story of why you care about this issue, as opposed to just lecturing them. And I did a lot of sort of vaccination stuff, especially among Latinos, in the early part of the pandemic when the vaccine came out. And I was like, I will tell them facts, and they will get vaccines, and it will be wonderful. And that was not what worked. That was precisely not what worked.
Well, I want to pull back and see how that maybe applies to journalism, because we have a question from Zell. As an educator in training, I'm wondering your thoughts on media literacy. What do journalists need educators to do to create a public that trusts the media and better understands how to distinguish between fact-based and more biased media? Does storytelling and empathy have a role here too?
Yeah, it does actually. I think storytelling and empathy has a huge role here, but there's just some practical stuff that needs to happen. When they've done studies and they've taken middle schoolers or high schoolers and they've shown them different types of websites, it is astonishing. Like 80% will have trouble identifying misinformation or information that comes from a non-legitimate source, and so so that's the first thing. It's very hard. We've all been caught out by it. Like even me, who's a professional journalist, I have clicked on something. I've been like, oh, okay, and maybe shared and been like, no, that is not true. And that is like, that website is not a real thing. And so we are flooded and inundated now with lots of things. So, I think media literacy is hugely important also just for kids' protection. It's not even just to save like the media, it's actually just for their own protection. The idea of like where I can get information that is actually, good for me and valid. So if I have a question about something, to do with my health or to do with my sexuality or to do with any of the many important things that kids want to know about, you can go to a place where you can find it. But there's two different problems here. So there's one thing about like learning about the facts and where and how to navigate the very complicated media landscape and where to go. And then there's a second stage to this, which is like, let's say I go onto the pages of the New York Times or NPR or whatever, LA Times or any other fact-based news organization. there's something else you also need to teach kids, which is like critical thinking, which is I'm going to want to read that. And I'm also going to not just be like, oh, okay, the New York Times says it, so that's true. I mean, it is true. It's going to be fact-based, but you're also going to want to put it through your own, filter and learn how to be a critical thinker and learn how to assess information and make sure that it, that it sort of squares with the things that you know. And that, I think, is where the trip up happens, because a lot of people come out of this and, they conflate lies and misinformation with critical thinking. And those are two different things. There are two different skill sets. You can go to a legitimate news organization and do critical thinking. But the other skill is like, you have to know something that is completely feeding you untruth.
Right. We just have a couple of minutes left. And I want to ask you then to take a look at journalism itself. And, we talked about the eroding trust in the news media as an institution. Do you have a sort of prescription for regaining trust here in the US?
So what I think is the following. I think that there is no magic thing that I can say that is going to regain trust. I think we're all ambassadors. We're all ambassadors. We're all sort of, as journalists, we're all trying to go out there and behave in a way that when I interact with someone, I want that person to come away from that interaction feeling like they understood what it was for and why I did it. and I interact a lot of times with people who have never spoken to a journalist before. And so, I take a lot of time sort of to explain, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. This is like, this is what on the record means. If you don't want me to actually report on something, you can say, I don't want that to be reported on, and I will abide by that. If you're not a public figure. And so, I think it's really important to be sort of like radically transparent. And then the other thing I think that's incredibly important is that if you're consuming media, anyone who's here, if you're a consumer of the media, make sure that you are, sharing things and talking about things that are actually, healthy for the body politic, that it's like the thing that we tell you about, like eating your greens and stuff. It's like, that some of it needs, that if you're passing it on, it needs to be healthy, because ultimately everyone here is an editor now. I'm not an editor anymore. I can write a piece, but you decide who sees it, because you are the one sharing it on all these different platforms. And so you, in a lot of ways, are actually an editor. You're a gatekeeper of information in this environment. And so you have a responsibility to think about the kinds of things that you're sharing and to whom and the impact that they'll have.
So we all have that red pen in a sense.
We do.
Before we have to wrap up, I wanted to ask you if you could share, because of course, a lot of us know you from your work with NPR and a lot of us miss you. What are you doing now? Tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I am working in New York Times Opinion Audio, and we're going to be having a show coming out, and it's going to be based around people's opinions. And it's kind of going to be about exactly what we're talking about here, which is how do people come to the things that they believe. And, the tagline is every opinion starts with a story. And so it's going to be about that exact idea of like, what are the steps that took someone to take them to a place where they believe a certain thing. And it is based around this idea that through empathy and through listening, it might not change our minds about what we think about what the person believes, but at least it will engage us. I find us nowadays, we shut down in ways we don't want to hear it anymore. And so the goal really is that if you come into it, you're at least going to come away with an understanding that you might not have had before.
Great. Well, Lulu Garcia-Navarro, such a pleasure to talk to you. I just want to say thank you so much for doing this and for sharing your experience.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I would like to echo that and thank you, Erin, for helping to lead and guide this conversation. It's been extremely valuable and very interesting. And I really look forward to the podcast when it comes out. I can't wait to hear the background on that. So reminder to the audience, first of all, thank you for attending, and you will get a short chance to give feedback after this is over. So thank you both for being here with us today, at least via Zoom. And we are looking forward to hearing from you again.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.